It's a great pleasure to welcome back once again Edmund Prestwich for a lecture on Ted Hughes, Torn Richness. Edmund.
I'll probably have a number of apologies to make at the end, which I hope you won't signal too vociferously. But I must apologise at the start that only one of the poems that I'm going to be reading is one that I've got a recording of Hughes himself reading. So it's going to be a bit vocally unvaried, but you will hear the voice of the master in the middle. In 1976, Hughes wrote a book called Poetry in the Making as a resource for teachers in schools. He compares his love of capturing animals as a child with the writing of poetry. You probably largely know this quotation. He says, "In a way, I suppose I think of poems as a sort of animal. They have their own life, like animals, by which I mean that they seem quite separate from any person, even from their author, and nothing can be added to them or taken away without maiming and perhaps even killing them." He was already an expert in the melodramatic overstatement. "Maybe my concern has been to capture not animals particularly, and not poems, but simply things which have a vivid life of their own outside mine." In the first poem I want to read, Hughes presents himself almost purely as medium, as experiencing an encounter with something living outside himself. The Thought Fox from his first collection, which is on your sheets, but if you'd rather just listen to it, I think that's all to the good. In it he presents poetic creation as the drama of a mysterious encounter in a place of strangeness and adventure, like the forests of medieval romance, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or something of that kind. I imagine this midnight moment's forest. Something else is alive. There's something almost magical about the way he makes us feel this drama will be important before we get to it. He speaks slowly, as if in a raptly attentive trance. Repeating the M sound, midnight moments forest, imagine, combines softness, the softness of with insistence. By drawing us into this raptly attentive mood, Hughes heightens the impact of the sensuous particulars when they do come. He's also, of course, suggesting that as a writer, he feels the presence of the poetic idea before it actually comes clear in his own mind. Suddenly, in stanza 3, clear perceptions replace the sixth sense awareness of some kind of presence. Hughes uses simple words, but they spring a series of surprises in the way they come together, making us imagine the fox from quickly changing angles. One of the biggest surprises, in a way, is the way we feel it by touch before we see it with our eyes. In real life, it would be the other way round, but this is a thought fox dawning in our minds, not a fox physically seen in the outside world. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. It's as if our first startled awareness of the fox is his touching our hands, or as if we've become the twigs and leaves of the forest. feeling the nose in the same way as they've been feeling the flakes of snow. What makes the impression so vivid is something in the rhythm. Tiny pauses between cold and delicately, dark and snow, nose and touches, twig and leaf, make us imagine the sensitive touching and withdrawing of the fox's explorations. When you've got, and there's a very technical sort of thing, but you can feel it even though you don't necessarily have a technical term for it. But if two stressed syllables come together, they kind of butt each other apart, like the positive poles of two magnets when you try and put them together. So if you say cold, delicately, you can't just flow the words into each other. Nose touches, comes a bit more, slides together a bit more, but again the two stressed syllables push apart from each other. Then I think there's a kind of shimmering between imagining things from the viewpoint of the fox, picking up its wariness, for example, on the one hand, and seeing it as an external object on the other. Finally, with the sharp, hot stink of fox, it's completely there. And the sharp, hot stink makes it seem disturbingly alien, and that adds to the sense of its being something outside Hughes's own life. Here's the poem. The Thought Fox. I imagine this midnight moment's forest. Something else is alive beside the clock's loneliness and this blank page where my fingers move. Through the window I see no star. Something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. Two eyes serve a movement that now and again, now and now and now, sets neat prints into the snow between trees, and warily a lame shadow lags by stump and in hollow of a body that is bold to come across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business, till, with a sudden, sharp, hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still. The clock ticks. The page is printed. Right from the start, these vivid renderings of individual lives suggest ideas about life in general. Hughes's earlier books are much possessed by a vision of what he called the war between vitality and death. In later books, the same basic sense appears more positively in terms of an acceptance of the interdependence of creation and destruction. His concern with these wider ideas means that the animals in his poems often become symbols, archetypes, even characters of myth. Sometimes this works marvelously. Sometimes it fails, at least for me. For me, failure happens when the symbolic meaning takes over from the reality of the individual animal. In other words, when you get Hughes actually doing the opposite of what he talks about in a poem like The Thought Fox. And when the projection of a vision of life becomes blustering, overblown and melodramatic, or just automatic parodying of himself. At the opposite extreme, there are poems that might not seem symbolic at all, poems of vivid naturalistic description and factual record. Here, Hughes seems to be simply registering and transmitting immediate experience. Larger ideas in poems of that kind seem to suggest themselves almost spontaneously. That makes the best of those poems quite marvellous. Many in a book called Moortown Diary are like that. Between the extremes, there are poems that bring together the naturalistic and the symbolizing sides of Hughes's imagination, so that the animal or thing he's describing does seem to be vividly alive in itself, at the same time as he makes big symbolic ideas shine through it or hover around it. Here, symbolism seems like a conscious extension of the naturalistic perception rather than a contradiction of it. And the example I'll discuss of that is October Salmon from River, which you have got. Before that, though, I want to look at Crow Tyrannosaurus, which you also have. Should be the second on your sheets, I think. A poem where the gap between naturalistic portrayal and symbolism is itself a reason for success. It's from a book called Crow, describing the adventures and misadventures of a creature who's sometimes vividly imagined in terms of a crow's body and physical movements and appetites, and sometimes in terms of a human being's mind, thoughts and reactions as he grapples with life, death, his own nature, the nature of the universe, and so on. The startling impact of those poems, their ability to get under our skins and catch us off balance, often depends on unexpected switches between these two different ways of seeing Crow, or two different responses on our part. I think the result in Crow Tyrannosaurus is both very serious and wildly funny. Comedy arises from both the substance of the poem and the nimbleness with which Hughes switches between different kinds of language. You could say that he's parodying himself in this, but doing it in a conscious, witty sort of way. In doing so, he buffets us between different ideas and different ways of seeing things. The very title seems to me to involve a darkly comical collision of ideas. Following on from that, the first stanza starts out swollen with a kind of parody of hyperbolical gloom in its solemn words and long vowels and so on. That tone is abruptly punctuated by a cartoonish description of Crow's nervousness as he hears it. Creation quaked voices. It was a cortege of mourning and lament Crow could hear, and he looked around fearfully. What Crow sees is not a cortege, but a nightmarish world of predatory pain. Language is violently physical. Horror's increased by the way the devoured prey seems alive and in agony in the bellies of the predators. One stanza, the swift's body fled past, pulsating with insects and their anguish, all it had eaten. The final twist is that though the predators move so energetically, They themselves seem to be in hell, the swallow fleeing, the cat writhing and gagging, the dog uttering shapeless cries. And yet, I've said this is a funny poem. Return to comedy comes as a surprising twist, not as an escape from the nightmare, but as an acceptance that there is no escape. Appalled at the cruelty of the world and his own place in it, Crow absurdly wonders whether he should starve himself to become the light. In other words, whether he should fly off into some sort of religious purity that's a denial of his very nature. Naturally, as he's a crow, instinct takes over. He sees a grub and reacts with the unhesitating suddenness of a mechanical release, his head trap-sprung, stabbed. However, he's still hopelessly divided. He heard weeping, grubs, grubs. He stabbed, weeping, weeping. Weeping, he walked and stabbed. Both the grubs and crow weep as he slaughters them, and he seems as much man as crow, because walked rather than hopped suggests a human gait. Altogether, the poem can be seen as a savagely comic satire on man's refusal to accept the universe as it is, to face up to his own inherently predatory nature. However, I think it's also a deeply felt poem about the dilemma of having to live in the world as it is and live with your own nature, while at the same time having capacities for compassion and aspiring to live by moral principles. I think it's the volatile way different feelings swirl round each other that makes this poem so powerful, as it reflects fundamental contradictions in the way we have to live our lives. And I think the comic element is what releases this anarchic swirl. Crow Tyrannosaurus. Creation quaked voices. It was a cortege of mourning and lament Crow could hear, and he looked around fearfully. The swift's body fled past, pulsating with insects and their anguish, all it had eaten. The cat's body writhed, gagging, a tunnel of incoming death struggles, sorrow on sorrow. And the dog was a bulging filter bag of all the deaths it had gulped for the flesh and the bones. It could not digest their screeching finales. Its shapeless cry was a blot of all these voices. Even man, he was a walking abattoir of innocence, his brain incinerating their outcry. Crow thought, alas, alas, ought I to stop eating and try to become the light? But his eyes saw a grub, and his head trap-sprung, stabbed, and he listened, and he heard weeping. Grubs, grubs, he stabbed, weeping, 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 he walked and stabbed. Thus came the eyes' roundness, the ears' deafness. The roundness of the eyes, I suppose, being the bird's vision, or all-round vision, the ears' deafness, the closing of sensitivities to the pain it's inflicting. The poems of Moortown Diary, at the opposite extreme, are mostly rapid improvisatory notes written down at the end of each day's work on the small farm Hughes was running in Devon with the father of his second wife. In fact, Hughes claimed to have deliberately short-circuited the shaping processes of poetry and intellect by writing his notes before going to bed, while the memories were still fresh and unsorted. This gives them great observational closeness, and I think also holds him back from interfering too much. Even more important, though, is a change in his relation to the animals he's writing about. As a working farmer now, he has a farmer's personal relation to them, an awareness of their changing emotions, not as generic cows and sheep, but as individuals. They can seem devastatingly human simply because he's got so close to them. In the poem I'll ask Paul to play in Hughes's own voice, Hughes writes about a lamb that died on the day of its birth. He's totally absorbed in the immediate situation, the lamb's wretched appearance and feeble struggling, its psychology and mental state, and its mother's baffled anguish, simply trying to register these lives outside his own life as accurately as he can. Paul, would you play Sheep? Thanks.
Sheep. The sheep has stopped crying. All morning in her wire mesh compound on the lawn, she has been crying for her vanished lamb. Yesterday they came. Then her lamb could stand in a fashion and make some tiptoe, cringing steps. Now he has disappeared. He was only half the proper size, and his cry was wrong. It was not a dry little hard bleat, a baby cry over a flat tongue. It was human. It was a despairing, human, smooth, oh, like no lamb I ever heard. Its hind legs cowered in under its lumped spine. Its feeble hips leaned towards its shoulders for support. Its stubby white wool pyramid head on a tottery neck had sad and defeated eyes, pinched, pathetic, too small, and it cried all the time, oh, oh, staggering towards its alert, baffled, stamping, storming mother who feared our intentions. He was too weak to find her teats or to nuzzle up in under. He hadn't the gumption. He was fully occupied just standing, then shuffling towards where she'd removed to. She knew he wasn't right. She couldn't make him out. Then his rough curl legs, so stoutly built and hooved with real quality tips, just got in the way, like a loose bundle of firewood he was cursed to manage, too heavy for him, lending sometimes some support, but no strength, no real help. When we sat his mother on her tail, he mouthed her teeth, slobbered a little, but after a minute lost aim and interest. His muzzle wandered. He was managing a difficulty much more urgent and important. By evening, he could not stand. It was not that he could not thrive. He was born with everything but the will. That can be deformed, just like a limb. Death was more interesting to him. Life could not get his attention. So he died, with the yellow birth mucus still in his cardigan. He did not survive a warm summer night. Now his mother has started crying again. The wind is oceanic in the elms, and the blossom is all set.
Most of Sheep 2 has a similar closeness of observation. That's also on your sheets. But it starts with an astonishing simile. After ewes have been shorn, apparently, lambs no longer recognise their mothers. Hughes compares the sheep's cries of despair with the screaming of the wounded after a battle. I think if you'd never read any other poem by Hughes, you would know he was a genius by the imaginative power of the way he brings these two scenarios together. I think the thought of the battle is something that obviously occurred to him spontaneously, but it seems to me that the way these two move into each other, are superimposed over each other, gives Sheep 2 a sort of an added dimension that Sheep 1 doesn't quite have. And another thing that is quite incredible, I think, in this poem is the image of the bowed women moving with water. I don't know, I can't account for why that seems so sort of penetrating and gives such a strong sense of something, I don't know, ritualistic and inescapable and sacred at the same time, but I think it does. Anyway, here it is. The mothers have come back from the shearing, and behind the hedge the woe of sheep is like a battlefield in the evening, when the fighting is over and the cold begins and the dew falls and bowed women move with water. Mother, 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 the lambs are crying, and the mothers are crying. Nothing can resist that probe, that cry of a lamb for its mother, or an ewes crying for its lamb. The lambs cannot find their mothers among those shorn strangers. A half hour they have lamented, shaking their voices in desperation. Bald, brutal-voiced mothers braying out, flat-tongued lambs chopping off hopelessness. Their hearts are in panic. Their bodies are a mess of woe. Woe, woe, they cry. They mingle their trouble, a music of worse and worse distress, a worse entangling. They hurry out little notes with all their strength, cries searching this way and that. The mothers force out sudden despair, blah, on restless feet with wild heads. Their anguish goes on and on in the June heat. Only slowly their hurt dies, cry by cry, as they fit themselves to what has happened. Slowly their hurt dies, cry by cry, as they fit themselves to what has happened. And obviously that will remind us of the idea of the necessity of accepting the world as it is. Remind us of Crow Tyrannosaurus and many of Hughes's other poems. But I think where the farmer's individual relation to his animals has come in is that there's a depth of understanding of how hard making that adjustment can be, a depth of compassion for the lambs that you just wouldn't have found in the first two books. In Hughes's first two books, nature tends to be grim and oppressive. He admires the energy and vitality that resist death, but he presents them in terms of violent self-assertion or stubborn endurance. There's not much softness. He even famously describes a snowdrop as brutal as the stars of this month, her pale head heavy as metal. In life, though, Hughes is described as having been easygoing, tender, and affectionate. Softer tones start coming into his poetry in Wadwoe. Much of his later work is remarkable for its magical, loving touch in evoking fragile, vulnerable things, and its ability to convey the wonder and joy of life. I'm particularly fond of a book called Season Songs, written partly with children in mind, and I'll read a few extracts from poems that are not on your sheets, so no good looking for them. The book begins with a poem about a calf born in March. This charming little piece ends with a buoyant and wholehearted celebration of energy, not as something powerful and pumping like the energy of a jaguar or something, but energy as youthful, lively openness and wonder, self-delight and harmony between the calf and its world. Hughes writes, "Soon he'll plunge out to scatter his seething joy, to be present at the grass, to be free on the surface of such a wideness, to find himself, to stand, to move." Spring Nature Notes ends with a line of calm beauty. The sun lies mild and still on the yard stones. You could imagine Edward Thomas writing that. And goes on to describe the eagerly burgeoning life of spring in rhythms whose airy lightness is unimaginable in Lupercal or The Hawk in the Rain. The whole air struggling in soft excitements, like a woman hurrying into her silks, birds everywhere zipping and unzipping, changing their minds in soft excitements, warming their wings and trying their voices. Power has a new sweetness in this world, whether it be the power of light. Over the whole land, spring thunders down in brilliant silence. Or the strength of trees carrying the weight of their new leaves in this conclusion to April birthday. And the trees stagger, they stronger brace their boles and biceps under the load of gift. And the hills float light as bubble glass on the smoke-blue evening, and rabbits are bobbing everywhere, and a thrush rings coolly in a far corner. Such impressions suffuse the whole volume. Crucially, though, there's nothing soft focus about it. It also records pain, mishap, and death. In fact, Sheep 1 and Sheep 2 are both reprinted from Moortown diaries. The march of the seasons pitilessly overwhelms many small lives. A cranefly in September, one of my favourites from the book, but not on your sheets, describes a dying cranefly with beautiful, close focus, tender, loving attention. At the end, though, the sky's northward September procession, the vast, soft armistice, like an empire on the move, abandons her, tinily embattled with her cumbering limbs and cumbered brain. One of my favourite season songs is The Seven Sorrows, describing the deaths and losses that autumn brings. But life is this whole with two faces, and even when the bite of winter is most keenly felt, the seeds of life are waiting to burst forth with the return of spring. So joy in later Hughes is not bought by sentimentality. His theme is still the necessity of accepting the order of being as a whole, accepting the interdependence of creation and destruction, life and death, joy and loss. But now, with the emphasis falling differently, falling on gratitude for what is given. This seems to me a wiser, more balanced response to life than the one we have in his first two books. And I want to close with a poem that expresses such a vision with particular power. It's October Salmon, the last on your sheets. This starts by bringing us very close to the salmon, simply by the familiar way it refers to him. In the first two stanzas, almost everything is small-scale, intimate, immediate, and sharply particular. There's a real empathy with the salmon, and this is part of the imaginative depth of the way he's created. We feel his vulnerability, and by making us feel the restfulness of the water, I think Hughes makes us feel his need for rest as well. With breathing in that lap of easy current, saying the words makes us feel how he's relaxing into it. At the same time, Hughes quietly sows the seeds of larger symbolic ideas that he'll develop later in the poem. After his 2,000 miles at sea, his 2,000 miles prepares us for the way the poem opens out to take in sea, earth, and surrounding heavens, relating the one small life to the vast whole. He's lying in poor water, a yard or so depth of poor safety, maybe only 2 feet under the no protection of an outleaning small oak, half under a tangle of brambles. After his 2,000 miles, he rests, breathing in that lap of easy current, in his graveyard pool. Breathing in that lap of easy current, in his graveyard pool. It's the womb and death coming together, isn't it? The whole poem seems almost structured around the contrast between an in-breath and an out-breath, in the way it moves between opposing poles of expansiveness and contraction, exhilaration and exhaustion, positive and negative. It's about a single salmon's death, but it's also about life as a whole. In the second stanza, that lap of easy current obviously refers to this last stage of the salmon's journey and life like a lap in a race. It also suggests the lap of a mother. The mother is the pool itself. Later in the poem, Hughes will call it the only mother he ever had. But in the next few lines, Hughes imagines Earth herself, or the whole force and all the processes of life on Earth, as a goddess. She's powerful, ruthless, beautiful, full of marvels, and the salmon's death is only a part of the wonder of her larger life. The sense of what he's lost is both saddening and reconciling. He's lost it, but he did have it. And it's wonderfully imagined as gallery of marvels, sweet months so richly embroidered. What's brought him to death is the very abundance and energy of life as he's worn out by life's tirelessness, her insatiable quest. As the poem proceeds, images of the present degraded state of the salmon alternate with images of his glory, power, and appetite in his prime, so that the very shape of the poem seems to be saying that life and death are two sides of the same coin. And it's interesting to contrast this salmon with Crow Tyrannosaurus. Hughes describes him as the splendour of the sea and the eye of ravenous joy, king of infinite liberty in the flashing expanse, the bloom of sea life on the surge ride of energy, weightless, body simply the armature of energy, in that earliest sea freedom, the savage amazement of life, the salt mouthful of actual existence, with strength like light. It's a totally different vision of predation to Crow's. Ravenous joy and savage amazement are part of the salmon's beauty, part of the wonder and exhilaration. Where Crow saw himself as the prisoner of his own nature and of the order of existence, the salmon is both undivided in himself and in harmony with the wider order on whose surge he once rode. The ravenousness of his joy is a reflection of life's own insatiable quest. The root meaning of splendour is shining. In his prime, the salmon was the splendour of the sea, both reflection and embodiment of its bright magnificence. He doesn't need to aspire to the light like Crow, shall I become the light. He is light, or was light, or at least like light, not only in his brightness, but in his strength. However, I don't want to suggest that the poem preaches a simplistic message of acceptance of the order of nature, or that Hughes is complacently settled in such an attitude. If it was just the didactic preaching of a message, it wouldn't really be poetry at all. That idea about life is one of the poles between which it swings. The other pole is grief and a sense of waste and loss. The last stanza brings a kind of balance and reconciliation. In it, positives and negatives are locked together as two different ways of seeing the same thing. On the one hand, the salmon is described as a loyal soldier, making a heroic and moral choice. On the other, the richness of life is torn. Its order is a doom-bringing machinery to which we can only submit. The salmon may be unthinking and undivided in its acceptance of how things are, and perhaps we can envy that unthinkingness. A human being inevitably responds with a consciousness that brings divided and conflicting responses. And I think the poem's great beauty is in the strength and sensitivity with which it reflects those contradictions. October salmon. He's lying in poor water, a yard or so depth of poor safety, maybe only 2 feet under the no protection of an outleaning small oak, half under a tangle of brambles. After his 2,000 miles, he rests, breathing in that lap of easy current in his graveyard pool. About 6 pounds weight, 4 years old at most, and hardly a winter at sea, but already a veteran, already a death-patched hero. So quickly it's over. So briefly he roamed the gallery of marvels. Such sweet months, so richly embroidered into earth's beauty dress, her life robe, now worn out with her tirelessness, her insatiable quest, hangs in the flow a frayed scarf, an autumnal pod of his flower, the mere hull of his prime, shrunk at shoulder and flank. With the sea-going aurora borealis of his April power, the primrose and violet of that first upfling in the estuary, ripened to muddy dregs. The river reclaiming his sea metals. In the October light, he hangs there, patched with leper cloths. Death has already dressed him in her clownish regimentals, her badges and decorations, mapping the completion of his service. His face, a ghoul mask, a dinosaur of senility, and his whole body, a fungoid anemone of canker. Can the caress of water ease him? The flow will not let up for a minute. What a change from that covenant of polar light to this shroud in a gutter. What a death in life to be his own spectre, his living body become death's puppet, dulled by death in her crude paints and drapes. He haunts his own staring vigil and suffers the subjection and the dumbness and the humiliation of the role. And that is how it is. That is what is going on there under the scrubby oak tree, hour after hour. That is what the splendor of the sea has come down to. And the eye of ravenous joy, king of infinite liberty, in the flashing expanse, the bloom of sea life, on the surge ride of energy, weightless, body simply the armature of energy, in that earliest sea freedom, the savage amazement of life, the salt mouthful of actual existence, with strength like light. Yet this was always with him. This was inscribed in his egg. This chamber of horrors is also home. He was probably hatched in this very pool. And this was the only mother he ever had, this uneasy channel of minnows. Under the mill wall, with bicycle wheels, car tires, bottles, and sunk sheets of corrugated iron. People walking their dogs trail their evening shadows across him. If boys see him, they will try to kill him. All this, too, is stitched into the torn richness, the epic poise that holds him so steady in his wounds, so loyal to his doom, so patient in the machinery of heaven. Thank you.